A flight attendant mocked a CIA officer mid-flight. Seconds later, his windpipe was crushed with one hand, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He mocked an innocent baby's cries, pinching his neck until the skin turned red. Subscribe if you believe no child should suffer cruelty. The first sharp cry rang out just as the overhead bins clicked shut and the final boarding call echoed faintly through the cabin. Caleb's tiny face twisted with discomfort, his fists balled tightly as he squirmed in his father's arms. Ethan Marlowe didn't flinch. He adjusted the swaddle blanket wrapped around his infant son, whispering a calming rhythm close to the child's ear. But the cry had already done its damage. Heads turned, brows furrowed. Some passengers sighed with the weariness of a long day. Others offered the kind of forced, thin-lipped smiles reserved for strangers with crying babies. From a few rows ahead, a man in a crisp blue uniform twisted around with exaggerated slowness. His name tag read Maxwell. His smile, wide and polished for passengers, faltered the moment his gaze landed on Ethan. The smirk that replaced it wasn't friendly. It was performative, calculated, the kind of expression that dared a man to push back. "Someone's got quite a pair of lungs," Maxwell called out with mock cheer, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Ethan didn't respond. His face remained neutral, his eyes on Caleb as he gently bounced him in rhythm with the faint tremble of the aircraft's engines preparing for departure. Still, his mind registered every detail: the tone, the forced volume, the shifting postures of passengers nearby, some suddenly uncomfortable, some silently amused. Maxwell moved down the aisle, greeting others with automated politeness. But when he passed Ethan's row, his steps slowed. For a brief second, he leaned in a little closer than necessary and gave an exaggerated sigh. "Hope he doesn't cry the whole flight." "We've had enough delays already," Ethan's jaw tensed. Still, he didn't look up. Not yet. Instead, he gently patted Caleb's back and whispered, "It's okay, little man. We're almost there." But the subtle shift in Maxwell's voice had triggered a chain reaction in Ethan's instincts, deeply trained, razor-edged, and always scanning for threats. This wasn't just irritation. It was performance. The kind that came from someone who enjoyed the spotlight of cruelty, someone who knew the exact volume to mock without crossing a legal line. The lights dimmed as the aircraft prepared for taxi. A chime echoed softly overhead. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. He wasn't on assignment, not today. This was supposed to be a quiet handoff, a simple domestic flight to Halvern City, where his brother would take over care of Caleb while Ethan deployed for a long-term operation overseas. Yet, as the plane began to rumble forward, Ethan opened his eyes to catch a reflection in the cabin window. Maxwell stood just a few rows behind, arms folded, whispering something to another crew member. There was laughter, brief, muffled, and pointed. Then Maxwell looked directly at Ethan and smiled again, this time with something colder behind his teeth. Ethan met the stare. For a second, everything else, engine roar, passenger chatter, even Caleb's soft fussing, faded. He studied the man's posture, rigid, rehearsed. Maxwell wasn't just a talker. He was a man who tested limits for sport. Caleb whimpered again, squirming harder this time. Ethan adjusted his position, turning slightly so his son's cheek rested against his shoulder. As he did, he felt the shift in air pressure, not from the engines but from Maxwell stepping closer again. "Need me to rock the whole plane so he'll sleep?" Maxwell asked with a laugh, drawing chuckles from a few passengers. "Or maybe offer him a little bourbon?" The joke hung in the air, tasteless and unwelcome. Ethan turned his head slowly and looked up at him, expression flat, eyes unreadable. "He's fine," Ethan said, voice low but firm. "We don't need anything." Maxwell lingered a moment too long. Then he moved on, his smile lingering in place but no longer reaching his eyes. Ethan watched him go, noting every step, every twitch of his fingers as he resumed casual interactions with passengers who saw only a cheerful attendant doing his job. But Ethan knew better. He shifted in his seat, adjusting the carrier strapped loosely to his chest. Caleb's breathing slowed, but he remained restless. Ethan whispered again, this time more to himself than the child. "We get through this. One flight. No mistakes." As the plane ascended and the city lights fell away beneath the clouds, Ethan settled back into his seat. But his calm exterior masked a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Something about Maxwell didn't sit right. Not just his words, but the way he moved, the attention he gave, the deliberate provocation. Ethan had learned to trust those signals. He had survived too many missions to ignore them now. The man wasn't done. And deep down, Ethan knew the first cry from Caleb wasn't the beginning of the discomfort. It was the opening bell. The storm was boarding the plane with them, disguised as routine service. Some people think they own the whole plane just because they can't control a baby. The words sliced through the low hum of the cabin like a rusted blade. Passengers shifted in their seats, some exchanging awkward glances, others pretending not to hear. The speaker, Maxwell Cray, stood just across the aisle, adjusting a stack of pre-departure safety cards in the overhead compartment with exaggerated care. His voice, loud enough to carry through 2 rows, dripped with mockery. Ethan Marlowe didn't move. His left hand gently rocked Caleb in his arms, thumb stroking the edge of the infant's soft cap. Caleb had been whimpering on and off since boarding, more restless than distressed, his small fingers occasionally clutching at Ethan's collar for comfort. The baby's noises were not loud, not disruptive, and yet, to Maxwell, they had become the perfect excuse. Maxwell let out a loud, theatrical sigh, drawing attention once again. "Oh no, the sky is falling," he said in a sing-song voice bending slightly toward Ethan's row. "Because the little one is upset." A strained chuckle rose from a nearby passenger, quickly swallowed by the tension that began to settle like fog over the cabin. A man in a suit coughed awkwardly. An older gentleman adjusted his newspaper and looked out the window, pretending to ignore the scene. Ethan's eyes remained on his son, his jaw clenched but his breathing even. Every movement of his was controlled, deliberate. Years of field conditioning weren't lost in civilian clothing, but beneath the calm exterior, his instincts stirred, trained instincts sharpened in embassies, deserts, and urban battlefields. And now, alarm bells rang in his mind, not from the mocking words, but from something deeper. He caught it in a flicker, Maxwell's eyes dropping to Caleb's neck. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but to a man like Ethan, it meant everything. He had seen it before, in interrogation rooms, during surveillance tales, in the eyes of men preparing to harm to provoke a response. Maxwell wasn't simply irritated, he was watching, calculating, testing. Ethan adjusted his grip on Caleb, cradling him slightly tighter. The baby let out a soft grunt but relaxed into his chest. He tilted his body slightly, subtly shielding Caleb with the edge of his coat. His eyes finally met Maxwell's. The attendant's grin stretched wider, but the smile never reached his eyes. "Relax, sir." "Just trying to lighten the mood," he said with exaggerated politeness before adding under his breath, "though maybe the rest of us would like a little peace on this flight." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he let silence do the speaking, the kind of silence that made the air heavier. Maxwell lingered a moment longer, watching Ethan as if daring him to respond, then turned on his heel and walked up the aisle, whistling lowly. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his ID badge glinting under the cabin lights. But there was something off, an edge to his walk, a stiffness in his posture. Ethan noted it all, every detail. He wasn't just cruel, he was composed, too composed. Ethan let out a slow breath, running his hand gently along Caleb's back. His mind scanned every possible scenario. Was this just an egotistical flight attendant looking for someone to belittle? Or was there something more? The flight attendant's manual banter resumed up front, a low chorus of small talk and procedural chatter. The captain's voice echoed briefly through the intercom, informing passengers of an on-time departure and smooth weather ahead. But Ethan wasn't reassured. He glanced around the cabin. Most passengers were now distracted, pulling out headphones, flipping through in-flight magazines, or tapping away on phones. But Ethan's focus stayed on the back of Maxwell's head, just visible near the curtain to the galley. Then Caleb stirred again, releasing a soft, tired whimper. Ethan hushed him gently, whispering, "It's okay, little one. I've got you." The plane began to taxi, and the engines hummed louder beneath them. But even as the cabin shifted into the rhythm of takeoff, Ethan felt the undercurrent. The calm felt too tight, like the skin of a balloon stretched to its limit. He adjusted his seatbelt, tucking Caleb safely into the crook of his arm. He thought again about that look, the way Maxwell had glanced at the baby's neck, not in annoyance but in anticipation, as if the crying wasn't the issue. But the child was. Had Ethan's cover somehow slipped? It was unlikely. He had taken every precaution: new papers, no electronic trail, zero indicators of his agency ties. This flight was meant to be invisible. A father escorting his infant son to a temporary guardian before an overseas deployment. But something about Maxwell's behavior didn't fit the mold of random cruelty. He thought of his handler's final warning at the gate. "You won't be followed, but you will be watched." Always assume it was Maxwell watching? And if so, for whom? Caleb shifted again, a soft breath against Ethan's collarbone. Ethan looked down, brushing a strand of fuzz from his son's forehead. The boy's face was peaceful now, unaware of the storm slowly gathering around them. He reached into his jacket pocket and fingered the outline of a hidden tracker disc, still dormant but ready to transmit. Just in case. He wasn't ready to press it, not yet. But every instinct inside him whispered the same truth. The flight was no longer routine. This was the first crack in something larger. The tension would build. The provocation wasn't over, and next time, it wouldn't just be words. When words cut deep, actions soon follow. Without warning, Maxwell Cray's hand shot forward. His fingers, rough and quick, pinched the soft flesh of Caleb's neck with a force that was deliberate and cruel. The baby's scream shattered the calm of the cabin, a sound so sharp and sudden that it froze the air. A few rows turned their heads, startled. Others remained rigid in their seats, eyes glued to devices, pretending not to notice. But Ethan noticed every detail, every millisecond of what had just happened. His gaze locked on the red marks blooming along his son's neck like a brand of humiliation, the evidence of another man's malice etched into the skin of a child who had no voice to defend himself. Caleb's cries rose higher, trembling through his tiny chest as his hands clawed helplessly at his father's collar. The small body shivered, not from the cool temperature of the cabin, but from confusion, fear, and pain. Ethan's arms instinctively tightened around him, drawing him close, shielding him. For a moment, time didn't move. Maxwell leaned back slowly, smirking as if he had merely flicked a crumb from his shirt, his eyes glinting with something colder than arrogance, satisfaction. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The act had already spoken louder than any insult could. Ethan's jaw clenched, the tension rising from his spine to his skull like a steel rod being forced into place. His training screamed at him to remain calm, assess, breathe. But the voice of a father, older, deeper, primal, was roaring in his chest, demanding justice. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, heavy and slow like a war drum. He looked at Maxwell, really looked at him. The man was retreating down the aisle now, casual, his posture exaggeratedly innocent, as if daring someone to confront him. Ethan's mind processed every detail, the subtle twitch of the shoulders, the way he adjusted his shirt cuffs, the smug rhythm in his steps. This wasn't a man who had acted out of frustration. It was calculated. It was controlled. It was a test. Ethan swallowed the fury pressing against his throat. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking from Caleb's red neck to Ethan's unreadable face. A man in a blazer in the window seat 2 rows up looked as if he wanted to say something but turned back toward his magazine instead. Another older gentleman across the aisle opened his mouth, then simply sighed and adjusted his headphones. Silence, thick and suffocating, reclaimed the cabin. No one moved. Caleb whimpered against Ethan's chest, each sob softer but raw, a sound that burrowed under his father's skin and latched onto something deep. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to keep his grip on rationality. This wasn't a street. This wasn't a battlefield. But that didn't mean there wasn't a war. He adjusted Caleb gently, brushing his fingers over the red welts on the baby's neck, careful not to press too hard. They were already swelling slightly. His hands trembled, not with fear, but restraint. Every nerve demanded action, but action here carried consequences. Witnesses, cameras, reports. Ethan had walked through cities on the brink of collapse and had faced enemies trained to kill without pause. But this was personal, and that made it infinitely harder. His mind split between roles, the officer calculating strategy, and the father trembling with fury. He could still feel the imprint of Maxwell's fingers on his son's skin, and in that memory lived a truth Ethan could not ignore. This wasn't an accident. It was an act of dominance, a predator pressing the edges to see if anyone would bite back. He could hear Maxwell laughing a few rows behind, a low chuckle shared with another attendant as if nothing had happened. Just trying to help the little one calm down, he muttered loud enough for others to hear, followed by another laugh. Ethan didn't turn. He didn't need to. His mind was already running through what needed to happen next. He had to pick the right moment, when noise and motion distracted the crowd, when Maxwell was within reach, when witnesses would see not just a man reacting, but a man delivering justice. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane shifted into cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign dinged off. A flight attendant began preparing the beverage cart, wheels clunking as it moved forward. Ethan sat still, breathing in through his nose and out through his mouth. Caleb was quieter now, thumb in mouth, head buried against his shoulder. But the pain hadn't left. Neither had the marks, and neither had Ethan's rage. He looked at the aisle, at the way Maxwell casually brushed past an elderly man trying to store his bag, at the way he laughed again, as if hurting a baby was just another joke between co-workers. Ethan knew then what must happen. The shift was subtle, but final. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a line that had been crossed, and Maxwell hadn't just committed an act of cruelty. He had written his own consequence. Ethan whispered softly to Caleb, "It's okay. I've got you." Then he raised his eyes, cold and focused, to the man who thought he'd won. When a man touches a child with cruelty, he signs his own sentence. Ethan's hand moved before his mind fully caught up. One moment, Maxwell stood smirking like a playground bully confident in his dominance. The next, he was yanked forward with such force that his feet slid half a step across the carpeted floor. Ethan's grip on the flight attendant's collar was iron, calculated, unyielding. The sudden violence of the motion made nearby passengers gasp aloud, their conversation snapping to silence as heads turned toward the unfolding scene. Maxwell barely had time to react. His smirk faltered, confusion flashing across his face as his chest collided with Ethan's, and then came the second blow, not with fists, but with fingers honed by years of precision. Ethan's other hand rose with perfect control and clamped around Maxwell's throat, palm pressed firmly beneath the jaw, thumbs pressing into the muscles just under the ears. It was not wild or impulsive. It was surgical. Maxwell's eyes widened as the pressure mounted. He tried to back away, but Ethan's locked arms kept him in place, his strength shocking for a man carrying a baby. Caleb whimpered against his father's chest, sensing the sudden change in the air, the tension that wrapped itself around the cabin like a storm cloud descending through clear skies. The other passengers were frozen in a strange limbo between fear and fascination. A man, seated 2 rows up, half rose as if to intervene, but the look Ethan gave him stopped him cold. There was no yelling, no chaos, just a chilling, focused silence around Ethan, as if the air had agreed not to breathe until he was done. Maxwell clawed at the wrist, crushing his windpipe. His feet danced awkwardly for balance, eyes bulging as the reality of the situation dawned on him. He had provoked the wrong man. "Oh, don't be so sensitive," Maxwell wheezed, voice strangled and weak, still trying to play the moment off as harmless. "It was just a pinch." But the words meant nothing now. They fell between them like stones in deep water, heavy and quickly forgotten. Ethan's face remained close, only inches from Maxwell's. His expression was unreadable, carved in stone, save for the fury simmering in his eyes. That fury was not loud or reckless, it was focused, restrained, terrifying in its calm. "You put your hands on him," Ethan said, his voice low, almost too quiet to hear, but every syllable cut through the cabin like broken glass. "You left marks on my son." Maxwell opened his mouth to speak again, but no sound emerged, only wheezing and spit. Ethan's hand never trembled. He adjusted his stance slightly to keep balance as Caleb shifted in his arm, pressing his small, tear-dampened cheek against Ethan's chest. The baby was still sniffling, confused but comforted by the security of his father's arms. That tiny heartbeat against Ethan's ribs fueled the fire inside him. He had seen evil across continents, in boardrooms, under flags, behind false smiles. But this was personal. Maxwell hadn't struck at Ethan's mission or at his agency. He had struck at the only pure thing left in his life. A voice crackled faintly from the ceiling. "Flight attendants, prepare for turbulence." But it was background noise, irrelevant in this suspended moment. The plane shuddered briefly, just enough to rattle a few drink cups and overhead bins, but Ethan's stance didn't budge. Maxwell thrashed now, more desperately, fingers slipping against Ethan's wrist. Red began to climb up his cheeks, the panic real and rising. Behind Ethan, a man in a business suit whispered to his neighbor, "Shouldn't someone stop him?" "No," came the hushed reply. "Did you see what that guy did to the baby?" The captain's voice returned faintly on the intercom, a general announcement about cabin pressure and flight time, oblivious to the storm brewing mid-air. Maxwell's knees bent slightly as if his strength was draining. The smug arrogance that had lived so proudly on his face now cracked and broke apart like ice under a boot. The man who had pinched a crying baby to provoke a helpless response now saw the monster he had awakened, and that monster was quiet, measured, and terrifyingly professional. Ethan leaned in further, his whisper cutting into Maxwell's ears like cold wind. "You will never harm him again." Maxwell's lips moved, pleading, but no sound came. The only thing loud in that moment was the pressure of Ethan's hand. The gasping, the widened eyes, the frozen stares of passengers, all of it faded to background for Ethan. The only thing that existed now was the balance between what he wanted to do and what he had to control. He was a father. He was also a weapon. And in that overlap, justice was being served. Maxwell's vision blurred. His fingers twitched against Ethan's arm, searching for relief. It didn't come. The intercom clicked again, but whatever was being said was lost behind the deafening silence of consequence. Maxwell's last ounce of arrogance crumbled as he locked eyes with Ethan, eyes that held no threat, only certainty. The hand of a father can be heavier than any law. Ethan's hand clamped down harder on Maxwell's throat, his fingers pressing into the soft tissue with terrifying precision. The moment was no longer about warning or intimidation. It was an execution of justice, cold and exact. Maxwell's eyes widened in panic, his feet scraping against the cabin floor as he tried to back away, but Ethan held him in place with the calm strength of a man who had seen war and chosen silence over screams. The contrast between the soft wailing of baby Caleb and the violent struggle between the two men created a surreal symphony of tension echoing across the tightly packed aircraft. Passengers erupted in confusion. A woman in the back shrieked. A man near the front fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking as he tried to capture what he was seeing. Some shouted, "Stop!" and "Help him!" But no one moved from their seats. No one crossed the invisible line that Ethan had drawn the moment he stood up. Maxwell's fingers clawed at Ethan's wrist, his face turning blotchy red. His breath came in gurgled gasps. It was the look of a man who had never truly believed that consequences could catch him. Not here, not now, not by a man carrying a child. But consequences had come in the form of a father whose entire being had narrowed to a single focus: protect the child at any cost. Ethan's mind was razor-sharp. His grip was not reckless rage, it was calibrated, like every takedown he had ever delivered in the field. He knew how long he could hold a man in a choke without permanent damage, how close he could walk to the line without crossing it. But this was different. This man had placed his hands on Caleb. The tiny, raised red marks on the baby's neck burned in Ethan's mind like a brand. The training screamed restraint. The father in him demanded retribution. A passenger in the second row, a tall, wiry man in his 20s, began to rise, eyes darting between Maxwell's convulsing body and Ethan's locked expression. The would-be hero's lips parted to speak, but Ethan turned his head slowly and met the man's gaze. "Sit down," Ethan said, his voice low but forceful, like a stone dropped into still water. The effect was immediate. The man froze, halfway out of his seat, and then slowly lowered himself back down. Around them, the cabin fell into silence, as if Ethan's command had rippled through the air and pressed down on every set of shoulders. Maxwell thrashed again, weaker now. His hand knocked over a plastic cup on the service cart beside him, sending soda fizzing down the aisle. Caleb cried louder, his tiny body curled into Ethan's chest, unaware of the raw fear he had stirred into the hearts of adults all around him. One flight attendant called out from behind, "Sir, let go of him, please." But Ethan didn't answer. He leaned closer, his eyes locked on Maxwell's fading arrogance. In a voice only the two of them could hear, he whispered, "You left marks on his neck. Now I leave marks on your soul." Maxwell's face contorted in a mixture of confusion and panic. He choked out a weak noise, too muffled to be a plea, too late to be a protest. The aircraft trembled as it entered a pocket of turbulence. The overhead compartments rattled. Some passengers gasped again, mistaking the shuddering of the plane for an explosion of violence. The lights flickered briefly, and for a moment, it felt like the whole cabin had fallen into another dimension, one where time stretched, and sound became a background hum to the primal showdown playing out in row 7. Ethan's grip remained steady. The turbulence passed, but the tension did not. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply stared, holding Maxwell there, not just physically but in a state of helplessness he would never forget. Around them, no one moved. Some passengers looked away, ashamed at their own inaction. Others stared, mesmerized by the calm fury radiating from the man with the baby in his arms. Ethan's mind was already preparing for what came next. He knew this couldn't last. Authority would come running. Questions would be asked. But for this moment, there was only one truth that mattered. He had chosen not to remain silent. He had drawn a line with his hands and made the world see it. He tightened his grip one last time, not enough to break, but enough to remind, and then slowly leaned in again, his lips barely moving as he whispered once more, "You left marks on his neck. Now I leave marks on your soul." Outside, the engines roared on as if nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. The air was thick with fear, not of the man with the baby, but of what happens when a father stops pretending he's powerless. As the plane rumbled through turbulence, the shaking only magnified the terror of the moment. Fear spreads faster than fire when one man refuses to back down. The intercom crackled overhead, jolting the cabin like a sudden shift in pressure. "Flight attendants, report the disturbance immediately," the captain's voice demanded, tight with confusion and urgency. Two male attendants rushed down the narrow aisle, dodging arms, knees, and wide eyes. Their footsteps thudded softly against the floor, the only sound louder than the low hum of the engines and the whispered gasps of horrified passengers. When they reached the scene near row 11, they froze in place. Maxwell Cray was pinned against the seat divider, his face drained of all its earlier arrogance. Ethan Marlowe's hand was wrapped tightly around his throat, thumb pressed just beneath the jaw, the pressure calculated and precise. The man's face had gone from flushed red to a pale bluish tinge. One of the attendants, a younger man with neatly combed hair and a trembling hand, shouted, "Sir, let him go. You'll kill him." But Ethan didn't move. His eyes, locked onto Maxwell's, didn't blink. His knuckles were tight and white, not from panic, but from discipline. Each joint held the tension of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how far he could go before he crossed the line. He was a coil of danger wrapped in calm. And yet, beneath it all, something deeper burned, the cold fury of a father. Caleb whimpered in Ethan's arm, shifting slightly against his chest, small fingers curling into his father's collar as if sensing that safety had finally wrapped around him. His cries, so sharp and panicked minutes ago, began to soften. The boy's body, though still trembling, no longer shook with fear. Something primal in him recognized the change in the air. The man holding him was not just his protector. He was his shield, his sword, his storm. Around them, the rest of the cabin remained suspended in collective disbelief. Phones were raised with shaking hands. Others simply watched, mouths parted, caught between alarm and awe. A few murmured to one another, whispers threading through the air like smoke, unsure whether to condemn or commend what they were witnessing. Maxwell clawed weakly at Ethan's wrist, but his strength was fading fast. His fingers scrabbled against the fabric of Ethan's sleeve, his legs twitching as his breath grew shorter. The smug grin that had once curled his lips was gone, replaced by panic. The kind of panic that came not just from being overpowered, but from finally understanding that he had misjudged the wrong man. Ethan's voice sliced through the tension like a blade through silence. "This man assaulted my son." He didn't shout, didn't snarl. His tone was low, level, almost too calm. That made it all the more chilling. "You all saw it." He mocked him, pinched him, and left these marks. He angled his body just slightly, enough for a few in the front rows to see Caleb's neck, where tiny red welts had already begun to rise beneath the soft skin. Audible gasps followed. The recording phones steadied. More hands reached for cameras. The tide of public judgment was turning, and fast. One of the attendants made a half-step forward. Ethan's gaze flicked to him. "Don't," he warned. The young man froze, eyes wide. Something in Ethan's presence, his stillness, his certainty, told him this was no ordinary father. This wasn't anger born of offense. It was protection forged by fire, and anyone who got in its way would be swallowed whole. Maxwell gurgled faintly, trying to speak, but Ethan wasn't interested in his excuses. He leaned in slightly, his grip firm but controlled, and whispered into Maxwell's ear, his voice low enough that only a few passengers nearby could hear. "Justice has a price," he said, "and today you pay it." Maxwell let out a strangled sound, a mix of breath and fear, as his legs sagged beneath him. His arms dropped. He knew now what kind of man stood before him. Not just a father, but something far more dangerous. A man trained to end threats. One who had lived in the shadows and never hesitated when the line was crossed. One row back, a middle-aged man in a tie attempted to rise from his seat, mumbling something about stopping the madness. But when Ethan's eyes met his, sharp, Unflinching, merciless, the man sat back down without a word, eyes fixed forward, hands gripping the armrest. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting slightly. The overhead bins rattled. A few gasps broke the quiet, but no one moved. If anything, the shaking only magnified the surreal horror of the moment. Maxwell flinched with the motion, but Ethan's grip never wavered. The movement of the aircraft was nothing compared to the turbulence coursing through the cabin. Another passenger whispered, "He's right. The baby has marks." Another muttered, "He crossed the line. What did he think would happen?" The attendants stood helplessly, caught between protocol and reality. Their training had not prepared them for this. They weren't dealing with an irate customer. They were witnessing something else entirely. Justice, raw and unfiltered. Ethan stood like a statue carved from resolve. The only sound now was the soft whimper of Caleb, pressed tight against his chest. And then, softly, Ethan added, not to Maxwell, but to the world watching, "In the balance between mercy and vengeance, a father knows which weighs heavier." He laughed at the CIA officer's infant, digging his nails so deep the child screamed in pain, certain no one would dare confront him. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. Maxwell's face was turning red, veins bulging in his forehead, his eyes wide and wild as Ethan's grip around his throat showed no mercy. The flight cabin had dropped into a stunned silence, a pressure cooker of held breath and disbelief. The only sounds were Caleb's soft, broken sobs pressed against his father's chest, and Maxwell's desperate, shallow gasps as his kicks grew weaker. Some passengers had risen in alarm, others clutched their armrests, frozen by the terrifying calm on Ethan's face. Then it happened. "That's enough." The voice cut through the tension like a blade, deep and commanding. Heads turned. A man in first class stood abruptly, tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that shifted the gravity in the room. His dark blazer hung open as he stepped into the aisle, his movements swift, practiced, and unshaken by the chaos around him. His footsteps were heavy but controlled, boots quiet against the carpet as he closed the distance to Ethan in long strides. Ethan didn't release Maxwell. Not yet. But he looked up, eyes narrowing. Recognition flickered across his features, not of the man's identity, but of something deeper. The way the man held his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the slight twitch of a concealed earpiece behind his right ear, it all spoke the same language Ethan had spoken for years. The man stopped just beside them, his expression unreadable. "Let him go, Marlowe," he said, the tone low and measured. Only someone trained in covert ops would have caught the embedded message. This is not the time or place. Ethan's grip faltered for a split second, surprise flashing in his eyes. "Your bureau?" he asked, just loud enough for the man to hear. "Shadow Detail," the man confirmed, keeping his voice neutral. "Name's Creel. Damon Creel. We've never met, intentionally. My job was to make sure your profile stayed buried." Until now, Maxwell choked and gurgled beneath Ethan's tightening grip. His hands slapped weakly at Ethan's arm, his earlier smugness shattered into raw panic. He was no longer mocking anyone. He was trying to breathe. "You picked a bad moment to step in," Ethan muttered, eyes blazing. "He left marks on my son." Damon's eyes dropped to Caleb, his tiny frame trembling in his father's arm, cheeks wet with tears, his neck still red from where Maxwell's fingers had dug in. Something in Damon's jaw clenched, a flicker of emotion that betrayed his own sense of rage. "I saw it," Damon said. "I wanted to move sooner. But if you do this here, now, in front of all these people, you compromise everything. You compromise him." The words struck Ethan harder than a punch. He could feel the strain in his fingers, the thrum of adrenaline pounding through every muscle. Years of combat, of field work, of surviving betrayals and ambushes, none of it had prepared him for the singular fury that surged when someone hurt his child. He looked around. Phones were still raised. Faces stared. some horrified, some awed, all watching, all recording. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He wasn't just a father right now. He was a field officer, under deep cover. And Maxwell, the man writhing in his grip, wasn't just a pathetic steward with a cruel streak. Something about him, the cold calculation in his eyes before the attack, the confidence he'd had in getting away with it, gnawed at Ethan's instincts. There was more to this, he was sure, but that reckoning would come later. Now, he had a decision to make. "You're lucky," Ethan growled at Maxwell, his voice gravel over stone. "If I weren't holding him, you'd already be cold." Maxwell's eyes widened with fear, and Ethan knew the man believed him. "Let go," Damon whispered. "Do it for him." "Not for me." Ethan looked down at Caleb. The baby's breathing had steadied. One small hand reached up, gripping the collar of his father's shirt as if sensing the storm might pass. Slowly, Ethan loosened his fingers. Maxwell collapsed onto the aisle, coughing and gasping, crumpled like a discarded puppet. His face was flushed, sweat pooling around his temples. A trembling flight attendant hurried forward but stopped when Damon raised a hand without looking back. "Not yet," Damon said, voice sharp as steel. The crew froze. Maxwell rolled to his side, wheezing. But Ethan wasn't watching him anymore. He kept his eyes on Damon, trying to read the man's next move. Damon leaned closer and lowered his voice once more. "We'll talk." "But not here." Not with ears on us, Ethan gave a curt nod. His heart hadn't slowed. He didn't trust easily, especially not someone sent to spy on him. But right now, Damon Creel was the only thread of order in a spiraling situation. Passengers murmured, tension leaking from their bodies like air from a punctured cabin. A few applauded softly, unsure if it was for Ethan or just because it felt like something had ended. But Ethan knew better. This wasn't over. This wasn't justice. This was delay. Maxwell coughed and glared at him, hatred bubbling behind the tears in his eyes. Damon crouched beside the man, just close enough that only Ethan could hear. "You will sit down and do your job," Damon told him coldly. "Any more provocation, and you won't have a voice left to use." Maxwell's shivering grew worse. The fight was gone from him, but something deeper, resentment, bitterness, still simmered. Ethan sat back in his seat, Caleb tucked protectively into his chest. The baby sighed, as if sensing the violence had retreated for now. His small head nestled into the crook of Ethan's arm. Across from him, Damon settled into an empty seat in the same row, eyes flicking toward every corner of the cabin like a man who never stopped scanning for threats. He leaned slightly toward Ethan and spoke without moving his lips. "We're not finished. You'll understand why I'm here soon enough." Ethan didn't reply, but his mind was already moving. If Damon had been assigned to shadow him, that meant his superiors had suspected something might go wrong. And if they had suspected that, then Maxwell's cruelty may not have been random. His jaw clenched. There was a deeper threat on this plane, and it hadn't shown itself yet. When allies reveal themselves, the battlefield shifts without warning. Ethan's hand eased slightly but did not release. Maxwell's skin burned beneath his fingers, hot and damp with fear. The attendant's throat pulsed erratically, his gasps shallow, desperate, scraping for breath like a fish out of water. Ethan's eyes locked on Maxwell's face, red, distorted, a mask of arrogance slowly crumbling into raw panic. The surrounding cabin, once filled with the casual murmur of travelers, had transformed into a pressurized chamber of silence. Passengers held their breath, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or the beginning of something irreversible. Damon stood inches away, his jaw tight, his eyes not just commanding, but pleading. "You kill him here," he said again, his voice barely audible over the mechanical hum of the aircraft. "And you bury your cover, your mission, and your son's safety." His words were knives, each syllable slicing through the fog of rage clouding Ethan's judgment. The pulse in Ethan's temple throbbed as his mind raced through 1,000 variables. He wanted to crush Maxwell for what he'd done. He wanted to leave marks that no apology or hospital visit could erase. But then his gaze dropped, and he felt it, a small hand, trembling but steady, curling into the collar of his shirt. Caleb. His son's touch was feather-light, but it grounded him like steel anchors. Caleb's presence had always been his compass, the one pure thing in his life not shaped by violence, strategy, or betrayal. Now, even in pain, the child reached for his father, not out of fear, but trust. Ethan exhaled slowly. The air tasted bitter, laced with restraint. He watched Maxwell's eyes widen with each second, watched the man struggle against a grip that didn't tighten further, but also didn't let go. Ethan's fingers remained locked around Maxwell's throat like a warning etched in flesh. Maxwell sputtered, coughed, and tried to speak, but all that came out was a ragged wheeze. The panic in his eyes deepened, no longer from the threat of death, but from the humiliation of being overpowered. His pride was bleeding now, more than his breath, and Ethan could see the shift. This wasn't just a moment of justice, it was a crack in Maxwell's armor. But whether the man would learn from it or turn more dangerous remained to be seen. Suddenly, the aisle shifted. A pair of attendants approached rapidly, eyes wide with fear. One of them, a tall, thin man whose name tag read Jasper, raised his hands in alarm. "Sir, please," he said, voice cracking. "You need to let him go. You'll kill him." The second attendant, a younger man barely out of training, looked frozen in place, caught between fear and duty. But before either could move closer, Damon raised a single hand. "Not yet," he said with the authority of someone used to command. The attendants hesitated, glancing between the man in the aisle and the one pinned beneath Ethan's hand. Ethan could feel the power of the moment, how it radiated outward, wrapping itself around every heart in the cabin. Passengers who had once been silent now sat rigid, phones gripped tightly in trembling hands. Some recorded, others prayed. A few whispered quietly, unsure of what story they were now part of. Ethan's voice, when it came, was cold and even. "You touched my son," he said without looking at anyone else. "You put your hands on him and left marks that don't belong to you." Maxwell blinked rapidly, eyes flicking to the phones around him, his breathing still uneven. "Did you think there wouldn't be a cost?" Ethan continued. His words were not loud, but they didn't need to be. They settled over the cabin like smoke after a fire, thick, suffocating, undeniable. "You mocked a crying child, then decided pain was an acceptable answer. You don't get to walk away from that like it was a joke." Damon moved a step closer, but he didn't interrupt. He knew this was necessary, not just for Ethan, but for everyone watching. Ethan looked around the cabin now, locking eyes with a few passengers. "You all saw it," he said. "You heard his words. You saw what he did. You think I'm the threat, but you weren't holding a child who screamed in pain because a grown man decided he could punish a baby for being a baby." No one spoke. Even the hum of the engine seemed quieter. Then Ethan turned back to Maxwell. His hand, still wrapped around the man's neck, finally released. Slowly, deliberately. Maxwell slumped to the floor, coughing violently, his face a mixture of rage, fear, and shame. The attendants stepped forward, unsure whether to help or flee. Damon's hand stopped them again. "He's fine," he said sharply. "Let him breathe." "That's all he needs right now." Ethan straightened. Caleb whimpered softly, shifting again, but the cries were fading, replaced by the warmth of his father's chest, by safety reestablished. Maxwell curled to his side, still coughing, and shot Ethan a look full of venom. But Ethan didn't flinch. He saw through it now, the desperation, the wounded pride, the predator turned coward. "This isn't over," Maxwell croaked, voice hoarse, eyes burning. Ethan didn't reply with words. His stare alone answered the threat. Damon, sensing the tension spike again, stepped between them. "That's enough," he said to both, voice like a steel bar in the wind. The attendants helped Maxwell sit up, but dared not lift him further. Passengers shifted in their seats, tension still wired through their posture, unsure if calm had returned or if it was merely hiding beneath the surface. Ethan eased back into his seat, holding Caleb tighter. His body trembled, not from fear, but from everything he had not done. Damon knelt beside him and spoke just above a whisper. "You chose right," he said, "but we're not out of this yet." Ethan gave the faintest nod, his eyes never leaving Maxwell, who now huddled near the galley, his coughing slowing but his pride shattered. The moment had passed, but the war had not. The choice between justice and survival is never clean. It always stains the soul. Maxwell collapsed to the floor in a wheezing heap, his limbs trembling as air finally returned to his lungs. The cabin, once held in the grip of suffocating silence, exhaled in one long, collective breath. A wave of murmurs surged through the rows, passengers turning to one another with hushed voices, torn between praise and unease. Some admired Ethan's calm but forceful defense of his son, while others glanced nervously toward the cockpit, wondering what kind of man had just nearly choked a flight attendant unconscious. Ethan didn't care about their opinions. His world had narrowed to the fragile weight of Caleb in his arms, the small chest rising and falling with each breath. The baby had quieted at last, clinging to his father's shirt with fingers still trembling from pain and fear. Ethan's gaze remained locked on Maxwell, who now shifted to his knees with a slow, staggering movement, like a wounded animal refusing to surrender. His eyes, red, watery, still filled with venom, met Ethan's. The hatred in them was raw, but no longer arrogant. It was the hatred of a man who had been exposed, humiliated, and disarmed. Damon moved forward, crouching beside Maxwell with practiced grace. The two men exchanged no words at first, only a heavy silence thick with unspoken warnings. Then Damon leaned in, his voice a cold whisper barely loud enough to reach Maxwell's ears. "You will sit down," he said, each syllable slow and sharp, "and do your job. Any more provocation, and you won't have a voice left to use." Maxwell recoiled slightly at the threat, his spine stiffening like a snake ready to strike, but there was no fire left in him, only smoke and wounded pride. He gave a shallow nod, swallowed hard, and pushed himself upright, retreating toward the rear galley like a beaten dog nursing invisible wounds. The tension in the cabin didn't vanish, but it thinned, like a storm cloud pulling back before a second strike. Ethan lowered himself into his seat slowly, deliberately. His heart still pounded beneath the layers of discipline, but his expression gave nothing away. Caleb nestled against him, the child's head resting near his shoulder, the red marks on his neck stark against the soft light filtering through the cabin windows. Ethan gently adjusted the boy's blanket, hiding the worst of the bruises, not to erase them, but to remind himself that vengeance had its time, and now was not it. Across the aisle, passengers stole glances at him. Some looked with gratitude, others with fear. A middle-aged man 2 rows up tapped his phone rapidly, whispering to his seatmate as if narrating a live documentary. Another, younger man raised his phone discreetly, capturing a few more seconds of the aftermath despite his shaking hands. Every lens, every whisper, every judgment, they all pressed against Ethan like invisible chains. But his mind wasn't on them. It was on Damon. The agent had taken a seat diagonally across from Ethan, posture relaxed but eyes alert. The illusion of a civilian traveler had fully dropped now. He was watching everything, every twitch, every step, every flicker of danger that might re-emerge from the broken silence. And yet, Damon's focus kept returning to Ethan. There was something more behind that gaze, a message waiting to be delivered. Ethan knew better than to force the issue in front of so many eyes. He kept his breathing steady, his hand cradling the back of Caleb's head, his body tense like a coiled wire beneath the seatbelt. His thoughts moved faster than the speed of the aircraft itself. Why had Damon intervened so decisively? And why now, after the worst had already occurred? The answer came without words. Damon leaned slightly closer, his lips barely parting as he murmured just loud enough for Ethan to hear. "We're not finished. You'll understand why I'm here soon enough." The words hit Ethan like a stone dropped in still water. Every instinct inside him surged to attention. The meaning was clear. Damon hadn't been on this flight by chance. He hadn't stepped in to protect a passenger or de-escalate violence. He had been watching Ethan from the start, embedded in the cabin like a failsafe, a quiet shadow sent by the very agency Ethan worked for. Ethan's jaw clenched as a new thread of dread took root beneath his skin. If his own agency had embedded a monitor on this flight, it meant they had expected something to go wrong. But not with Caleb, not with Maxwell, with him. His eyes scanned the cabin once more, slower this time, more calculated. Every face that avoided his gaze was noted. Every hand that hovered too long over a phone. Every passenger who had remained unusually silent through the chaos. Each one marked in his mind. The danger had not passed. It had only changed its shape. He looked to Caleb, sleeping now, his breath soft against his collar. The infant knew nothing of espionage or betrayal, but Ethan did. And now, more than ever, he would not let his guard down. He felt it in his bones. The turbulence of the flight had nothing to do with weather. Somewhere in the metal belly of this aircraft, a deeper plot waited to unfold. The only question was, when? The greatest battles are fought not against enemies, but against shadows hiding among allies. The flight resumed a strained calm, but the silence in the cabin was brittle, one sharp word away from splintering again. Ethan sat with Caleb resting against his chest, the baby's tiny hand curled loosely around his shirt collar. The hum of the engines filled the space like background static, but Ethan's ears were trained to filter through noise. His focus locked on the galley behind him. Something was off. Maxwell sat hunched near the crew station, nursing his bruised throat with trembling fingers, his uniform collar askew and sweat glistening on his brow. A lesser man might have been humbled by such a confrontation, but the look in Maxwell's eyes spoke of something colder than humiliation, calculated fury. His lips moved quickly, but not to complain or reflect. He held the galley phone in one hand, the cord stretched taut between his shoulder and ear. His voice was low, urgent, and filled with strange specificity. "I repeat, subject is highly trained," Maxwell muttered, his tone clipped and clinical. Chokehold lasted approximately 14 seconds, controlled. No panic. Precision grip across the larynx. No hesitation. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Those weren't the words of a man venting after being attacked. That was reconnaissance, assessment, reporting. He wasn't talking like a wounded victim, he was talking like a scout feeding information to a command unit. Damon, seated just across the aisle under the pretense of a weary traveler, leaned ever so slightly toward Ethan, his ears just as trained to catch coded language. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked without turning. "I did," Damon replied under his breath. "That wasn't a complaint." That was a status update. Ethan felt a chill ripple down his spine. The flight attendant wasn't just some cruel, petty man who took pleasure in mocking a child. He was more. Much more. Maxwell's voice dropped further, but a phrase cut through like glass. "Confirmed chokehold execution. Subject moved with military cadence. No civilian tells." Infant remained attached throughout. That last sentence hit Ethan like a gut punch. Infant remained attached. This wasn't just about him. It never was. They were watching how he moved, how he protected Caleb, how fast he reacted, how he restrained himself. The baby wasn't just a trigger. They were watching how Ethan handled leverage. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching slightly around the hem of Caleb's blanket. Caleb stirred, letting out a soft sigh, but did not cry. The boy's small face nestled against his father's chest, innocent and unaware. That innocence was the very thing they had tried to violate, and now Ethan knew why. "I don't think this was about getting a rise out of you," Damon whispered. "I think it was a test. See how fast you snap. See what you're willing to reveal." Ethan's gaze didn't move. His breathing was calm, but every cell in his body was awake. "I knew something was wrong the moment he pinched Caleb," Ethan said quietly. "That wasn't impulse. That was strategy. Pressure points. Maximum pain with minimal mark. It was rehearsed." Maxwell ended the call and glanced over his shoulder. For a brief second his eyes met Ethan's, and what looked back was not fear, not remorse, but calculation, like a man who had finished step one of a longer plan. "He's not working alone," Damon added, his voice now clipped with urgency. "He's feeding this in real time." That was a tactical field update. Marlowe Ethan's hand instinctively adjusted Caleb's position, shielding the boy as his mind reeled through possibilities. Maxwell didn't just stumble onto this flight. He had been placed, planted. Ethan spoke, his voice a whisper of thunder. "He's a sleeper." One of theirs, Damon nodded once. And Caleb might be the target. Ethan froze. The noise in the cabin, the passengers shifting, the seatbelt signs blinking above, it all faded into a low hum. All that remained was the pressure in his chest and the rising tide of rage in his blood. "If they know about him," Ethan muttered, "then they know about me. My mission. My past." "Which means this flight isn't just a route to Halvern," Damon replied. "It's bait." Or worse, transport. Ethan's mind sharpened like a drawn blade. The mission had never been simple. It had been sabotaged from the start. They weren't trying to derail him. They were trying to extract something. Or someone. And they were already airborne. "We have to assume there's more," Damon said. "More agents." "More eyes." Ethan gave a single nod. He shifted Caleb again, holding him tighter, shielding his son with his body like a fortress built of flesh and fire. His thoughts burned through every possibility. He wouldn't let them take him. He wouldn't let them get close again. He glanced toward the back of the plane where two passengers sat stiffly, their arms too still, their eyes scanning just a beat too slowly. "The next move is theirs," Ethan whispered. "Or ours," Damon corrected, voice cold and focused. Ethan's eyes returned to the galley, to the man who had dared harm his child. But Maxwell was no longer muttering. He was waiting, watching, and smiling, because he thought he still held the knife. But Ethan had already felt the blade, and now he was sharpening his own. Sometimes the cruelest hand hides the sharpest dagger. Maxwell's muttered report was like ice water down Ethan's spine. He hadn't meant to overhear it, just a shift of cabin noise, a lull in the hum of engines, and then the unmistakable cadence of a coded call. "He's controlled, chokehold precise, likely trained, passenger in seat 14C. The words came through the galley phone in short bursts, masked by the clatter of plastic cups and crew chatter. But Ethan heard them. Not because he was paranoid, but because he had been trained for moments just like this. From his seat, still clutching a now quiet Caleb, Ethan's eyes slowly lifted toward the galley. Maxwell had his back turned, phone angled low, voice barely audible, yet the shift in his posture, the subtle tilt of his head, betrayed more than carelessness. It exposed intent. This wasn't a man complaining to his supervisor. This was a field report, brief, clinical, full of behavioral markers. Damon, seated just 2 rows ahead, had caught it too. Ethan saw him stiffen ever so slightly, the same way he had when a safe house in Ankara was compromised by a wrongly folded newspaper. The same tension now rippled beneath the cabin's fragile calm. Damon stood and drifted toward the rear lavatory. Not rushed, not suspicious, just another man needing to stretch his legs. As he passed Ethan's seat, his fingers brushed the headrest, too casually for anyone else to notice, But Ethan felt the message. Eyes up. Rear aisle. Red 2. Ethan's gaze followed naturally, scanning without lingering. 2 men sat near the last row, separated by few seats, both dressed like average travelers, loose jackets, phones in hand. But something about them didn't fit. The left one never blinked during turbulence. The other kept his feet flat on the floor, body tight, spine too straight for comfort. Most telling of all, when Ethan's eyes passed over them, both men made the same mistake. They held eye contact a fraction too long, as if confirming a threat rather than ignoring one. The realization crashed through him like a wave. This wasn't about an insult or an overstepping attendant. This was a stage, and Caleb, his son, his blood, was the centerpiece. He exhaled slowly, shielding the movement of his lips with Caleb's blanket. "Damon," he said under his breath, knowing the man had stopped just past the aisle and was listening. "We're boxed." Damon's reply was low, barely audible. "Confirmed. 2 assets in the rear. Maxwell's the trigger." Ethan tightened his hold on Caleb. The baby stirred, his small fingers grasping at the collar of Ethan's jacket, unaware of the men that wanted him for leverage, unaware of the storm closing in. Ethan bent slightly, pressing a soft kiss to the crown of Caleb's head, but his eyes burned with a fire that no father should ever have to feel. "Why now?" he whispered, mostly to himself. "Why here?" Damon's reply came with a steady rhythm. "Because you're exposed. You're vulnerable, and they've marked the child." It was the truth he had refused to consider until now. The mocking, the pinch, the red marks. They weren't just casual cruelty. They were a tag, a signal. Someone had flagged Caleb, not as a child, but as an asset. And Ethan, for all his training and instincts, had walked into it thinking it was just about decency. "They want the plane to land," Damon added, stepping backward down the aisle with a practiced stretch, "in Ralmer Field." Ralmer Field, a minor civilian strip surrounded by decommissioned warehouses. Ethan had seen the manifest. The flight was rerouted for weather concerns shortly after boarding. He hadn't questioned it, just another cloud on a routine mission. "Controlled by Eastbourne assets?" Ethan asked, voice sharp now, jaw clenched. Damon nodded once, slowly. "Maxwell's the inside man. The others are insurance. They're guiding us into an ambush." Ethan's heart thudded heavily beneath his ribs. Every choice from this moment forward was no longer about survival. It was about legacy. If he fell, Caleb could be used, twisted, bartered. The thought of his son in enemy hands, raised by syndicate handlers or used as bait for future missions, ignited something primal in him. His eyes locked with Damon's. "If this is a trap," Ethan whispered, adjusting the strap around Caleb's chest, "we turn it inside out." Damon's expression didn't shift, but his fingers twitched once, an affirmative signal from one ghost to another. In a world built on secrets, their plan would unfold without a word, only silent nods and gestures between 2 men forged in shadow. The hunters thought they had built a perfect snare. They had underestimated what would happen when the prey decided to bite back. When hunters lay a trap, sometimes the prey teaches them fear. The moment shattered in a heartbeat. Without warning, one of the men in the rear section shot to his feet, knocking over his tray with a loud clatter. His jacket swung open, revealing the brief glint of something metallic beneath, too small to be a gun, too precise to be anything innocent. His eyes locked on Damon with a cold, practiced focus, and then he lunged forward with brutal intent. The cabin erupted into chaos. Screams pierced the air as passengers ducked or threw their hands over their heads. The illusion of a routine flight fractured in seconds. Seatbelt lights flashed overhead, but no one was sitting still. Panic spread like wildfire. Flight attendants yelled incoherent warnings, one fumbling to reach the intercom before freezing in terror. Ethan didn't hesitate. With practiced precision, he shifted Caleb into one arm, cradling the boy tightly against his chest. Caleb's small body trembled, but his cries were silenced by fear and instinct. Ethan's other hand reached out like a strike of lightning, bracing against the seat in front of him as he launched into the aisle, cutting through the moment like a blade. The second man, stationed across the aisle, moved next. His hand disappeared into his coat. Ethan saw the shape beneath the fabric, a slim, tactical blade, and didn't wait for it to appear. His boot slammed into the narrow aisle as he pivoted, ramming his elbow into the man's ribs with explosive force. The man staggered back, grunting in pain, but still reached for the weapon. Ethan's mind split into instinct and strategy. Caleb's weight against his side reminded him of what was at stake, not just survival, but protection. He spun on his heel, grabbed the attacker by the lapel, and drove him backward into the edge of the seat. A sickening crack sounded as the man's head collided with the armrest. His eyes rolled back, body sagging instantly. A blur of motion to the left. Damon had met his attacker head-on. Their bodies collided like freight trains in a narrow corridor. Fists flew, blunt and unforgiving. Damon's opponent swung wildly, landing a blow to his shoulder, but Damon absorbed it with a grunt and retaliated with a swift uppercut. The man reeled, but didn't fall. Their struggle turned savage, fists and forearms hammering through the air with the raw power of two trained operatives meeting without pretense. And then a voice rang out above the noise, sharp and commanding. Too sharp to be a passenger's panic. "Take the package. Forget the father." Maxwell. He stood in the galley, his face flushed and twisted, his uniform disheveled. The fake smile he had worn so long was gone, replaced with the bark of a handler giving orders. His eyes weren't on Ethan. They were on Caleb. The word package sent a jolt down Ethan's spine. It wasn't just a label. It was confirmation. They weren't after him. They were after his son. For the briefest moment, the world froze around him, his breath held tight, Caleb's whimper muffled against his shirt, and the reality of what Caleb truly represented slamming into him like a freight train. He had been marked, not for who he was, but for who his father was, and that meant they would never stop. Fury surged through Ethan like a tidal wave, fueled by a fire so hot it threatened to burn through his control. He turned with lethal purpose, stepped over the unconscious man at his feet, and charged down the narrow aisle. Maxwell saw him too late. "Wait," the man stammered, backing toward the cockpit door. But Ethan didn't wait. He surged forward, moving faster than thought. One hand gripped the headrest to vault over a toppled drink cart, the other still protecting Caleb with every movement. Passengers scrambled to press back into their seats, eyes wide as Ethan closed the distance like a shadow turned solid. Maxwell reached for the cockpit handle. Ethan grabbed his collar first. The attendant's body slammed against the bulkhead, the air whooshing from his lungs. He twisted, tried to struggle, but Ethan pressed forward, one hand holding Caleb close, the other forcing Maxwell to face him eye to eye. "You touched my son," Ethan growled, his voice low and thunderous, each word vibrating with controlled rage. "Now, you answer to me." Maxwell's mouth opened in a wordless gasp. Behind them, Damon dropped his opponent to the floor with one final, crushing chokehold. The second man groaned in unconscious surrender. A passenger began to sob softly near the emergency exit. Phones were still recording, trembling in hands too stunned to lower them. Ethan didn't blink. His eyes locked on Maxwell as the man whimpered, his earlier arrogance dissolved into something pitiful. The uniform he wore no longer symbolized authority. It was a costume stripped bare. And Ethan, he was no longer just a father or an agent. He was the reckoning that had boarded this flight without warning. The hunted had become the executioner. Maxwell hit the carpeted floor of the cabin with a hard thud, his limbs flailing as Ethan dragged him by the collar through the narrow aisle. His eyes were wild with terror, darting from the faces of stunned passengers to the cold steel in Ethan's stare. His earlier arrogance had drained completely, replaced by the hollow panic of a man who realized too late that he had triggered something far beyond his understanding. Behind them, Damon knelt beside the two unconscious operatives, securing their wrists with zip ties pulled from his carry-on, every movement calm, methodical, practiced. The air reeked of fear, sweat, and adrenaline. Caleb whimpered softly, his tiny fists clinging to the fabric of Ethan's jacket. His sobs had faded into uneven breaths, like he could sense that the worst of the storm had passed, but not yet forgotten. Ethan adjusted the boy in his arms with one hand while keeping a firm hold on Maxwell with the other, every step calculated, his boots thudding dully against the floor. The cabin, moments ago a war zone, was now suspended in a breathless silence. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came on, low and tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to an onboard incident requiring immediate intervention, we are diverting to a secure airstrip under federal direction. Please remain in your seats." No one moved, not a whisper stirred. The voice of the pilot confirmed what they had already guessed. This wasn't just turbulence or a security scare. Something larger was unfolding, and they had been in the middle of it. Maxwell groaned beneath Ethan's grip, clutching at his bruised throat. "You don't know what you've done," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "I know exactly what I've done," Ethan replied, his tone flat and deliberate. "I kept my son alive." Outside, through the small cabin windows, the landscape shifted. Mountains faded into plains, and a long stretch of tarmac emerged below. As the plane descended, black armored vehicles dotted the runway, positioned with intention, like chess pieces on a final move. When the wheels touched down, the jolt wasn't just mechanical, it was emotional. The moment the plane stopped, the main door opened and a surge of heavily armed agents stormed inside. Their boots echoed against the fuselage as they moved with military precision. Passengers gasped as the tactical team swept through the aisles, weapons lowered but ready. "Clear left," one agent barked. "Secure the package." "Restrain hostiles." Ethan raised his hand slowly, signaling his identity. "Ethan Marlowe, asset secure. Hostiles neutralized." A sharp nod from the lead agent followed. "We've got it from here." Damon stepped aside as the operatives were hoisted from the ground and shackled. Maxwell was the last to be taken. He tried to resist, muttering about immunity and connections, but the agents showed no hesitation. His hands were bound behind his back, his face pressed against the sidewall of the cabin. As they were marched down the aisle, a few passengers instinctively shrank back in their seats. Others watched wide-eyed, still clutching their phones but now too shaken to record. Ethan remained standing, Caleb tucked tightly in his arm. He didn't speak, didn't move until the last enemy operative was removed from the aircraft. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the residue of fury, from the realization that everything had been more than personal. In the debriefing that followed, held in a mobile command center just beyond the airstrip, the truth unfolded with painful clarity. Damon stood at the center of the tent, arms crossed, as an intelligence officer relayed the findings. "Caleb Marlowe," the agent said, tapping on a digital tablet, "was flagged 6 months ago by an international espionage ring. Not because of anything he did, he's a child, but because of who his father is. They identified your bloodline, your recent travel patterns, and used that data to mark him as a vulnerability." Ethan felt his stomach sink. So, this wasn't random. Maxwell, the mocking, the pinch, it was all part of it? The agent nodded grimly. The pinch was a signal. Meant to mark the child physically, confirm identification, and provoke you. They needed you to reveal yourself. Ethan closed his eyes, Caleb still asleep against his chest, unaware of how close the world had come to losing him. "They underestimated you," Damon said quietly, stepping closer. "They thought fatherhood would make you weak. It made you unstoppable." Ethan didn't respond right away. His fingers brushed Caleb's hair as he stared into the distance, the weight of the truth pressing on his chest like a second gravity. Everything he had done, all the missions, all the sacrifices, had somehow painted a target on his child, but they had failed. Outside, the sun had begun to rise. Light spilled over the edge of the mobile command tent, casting long shadows across the floor. An agent passed Ethan a thermal blanket for Caleb and a sealed report for review. He didn't open it. Instead, he bent his head low and whispered into his son's ear, more to himself than the sleeping boy. "The world may hunt us, but I will always be the hand that shields you." He scarred a baby's neck with his grip, only to feel his own throat crushed in a single hand. If you stand for dignity, justice, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of disrespect, humiliation, and the explosive consequences of provoking someone with hidden power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire accountability, empathy, and justice in the face of abuse and cruelty.